Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, you're going to learn how to make this feature section using HTML and CSS. So we're going to use the terminal in order to create the folder and files that we need for this project. Now, I think it's really important to get used to using the terminal as soon as you can, because as you advance as a web programmer, you're going to be using terminal all the time, and really you're going to be wanting to use the terminal because there's a lot of languages and tools and services that have command line interfaces that make it really easy to work with these different technologies. So what we're going to be doing is very basic, and the first thing we want to do is we want to type out ls, and this is going to list all the folders that are in our current directory, which is in our root directory. And what we can do is go into the desktop, and you don't have to write desktop all the way out. You can just begin typing where you want to go and then hit tab, and it will autocomplete, and then you can hit enter return. You can now see that we're in the desktop. And to create a folder, just write make dir for make directory, and then just call this something like blob section. And once I hit enter, you'll see that blob section is now in our desktop. Then let's go ahead and actually go into the blob section. And then let's go ahead and write touch, which is going to allow us to create files. So index.html and styles.css. And then let's do ls to list those out. And now you can see those two files printing to the console. And now what we can do is we can write out code and then period. And this is going to open our project in a Visual Studio Code. Now, if you're using a Mac, you're going to have to enable this feature, but I'll link a link in the description. They'll show you how to do that. It's really simple. It's like one thing you have to enable in Visual Studio Code. And once you have that enabled, you can just hit enter return, and your project's going to open up here in Visual Studio Code. So let's go ahead and get out of the terminal. And let's go ahead and maximize this window. Get rid of this welcome screen. And then let's go ahead and talk about some of the extensions that we're going to be using. So in order to install an extension, you can come down here to this icon. And the ones that we're going to be using is, the first one's called Live Server. And if you click here, you can go ahead and install this one by clicking on the button up here. And what this does is essentially just allows us to use the HTML page that we're going to be creating and actually create a server so we can actually see the changes as we're writing them. And this is going to be really helpful so we can see the HTML, as well as when we're writing the styles, we can see those styles change live as we're actually doing it. All right, so the next one we want to do is HTML boilerplate. So right here, go ahead and install that. And we're going to be using this just to insert some starter code for our project. So let's come back into our files here, exit out of this, and open our index. Now let's go ahead and just start typing HTML. And you can see here the boilerplate is going to show up. And now we have some really simple HTML boilerplate code. And what I'm going to do is pull in the styles CSS. And let's go ahead and just give this a title. We can do a blob section and give this a description as well. Awesome blob design. All right, so now we have that. Let's go ahead and get rid of this right here and start writing our HTML. And the first thing I'm going to do is write a main tag. And in here, we're going to have a section. And this section is going to have a class called feature. And in this is going to have two divs. And the first one is going to have a class called feature left. And the next one, I'm just going to copy this and paste it in. And this is going to be feature right. And in the feature left, we're first going to have an h2 tag with a class of feature header. And let's go ahead and just give this the header title from our design. So awesome new feature. And next up, we're going to have just some paragraph tag here. If I can actually type, there we go. And I'm going to come into our design here in Figma and just copy this lorem ipsum. And before I do that, I'm going to give this a class of feature text and then paste that in. And now what we can do is we can come in and add our link here. And this link, let's go ahead and give this an href first. And this href is where the link would be pointing to, but because this is just a dummy link, I'm just going to put a £. Then I'm going to give it a class equal to feature CTA and give this just the CTA from our design, which is explore new feature. All right, so that's everything for the left section. Now that we have this content in here, let's actually boot up live server so we can see this and actually happening in real time. So what we want to do is we want to come over to index.html, right click, and then click on open with live server. And this is going to open up in your default browser, which for me is Chrome. Then I'm just going to resize these windows so we can see this a little better. And let's go ahead and close that out so we can see this. All right, so now what we want to do is just import an image. Now, actually, before we do that, we need to create a folder here. So I'm going to right click and say create folder and call this images, and then pull in the blob SVG that we've created in Figma. And I'm just going to drop that into the images. And it's going to open this by default, but just go ahead and exit out of that. And then I'm going to minimize this window. And then we can import the SVG using an image tag, setting the source to the location where the blob SVG is. Let's go ahead and give this an alt tag. Just call this feature image. And then let's go ahead and close off that image tag and then save it. And now you can see this SVG is now pulled in. So that's basically everything for the HTML. There is one more thing we want to do, and that's to go to fonts.google.com. And we need to go ahead and import the fonts that we're using. So the first one is going to be Roboto. So let's just search for that and click here to add that to our selection. The next one is Laura. So let's go ahead and click here and add that as well. Come down to this little panel, coming into Customize. And on Laura, we need the regular and the bold. And on Roboto, we actually just need the bold and we don't need the regular. So let's come into Embed, copy this link here, and go ahead and paste that right after our styles CSS import. And now we can just reference those styles by using the following right here. Cool, so let's go ahead and exit out of that. We don't need Google Fonts anymore. And now let's go ahead and open up our styles CSS, and let's minimize this so we can see it a little better. And just to save some time, I'm just going to copy some CSS variables here and just talk about what these are doing. And first we want to target the root pseudo class. And what this means is that this is going to be the root element of our project. Now, because this is an HTML project, the root element is going to be the HTML here. So by calling root like this, it's going to ensure that these variables are accessible by everything inside the HTML element. And the way you write an actual CSS variable is by writing 2 dashes followed by the name of the variable, a colon, and then what that variable is equal to. And these values, if you're not coming from Figma, is just coming right from our Figma design. So if you didn't actually watch this tutorial, we created these color styles and then set those colors to specific hex codes. So we're just kind of, because we have those color styles and we're kind of using those as variables, we want to carry over that same idea in our code. All right, so now that we have that, you save that, nothing's really going to change because we haven't used these variables yet. And the next thing I'm going to do is just some basic resets. So we're going to do box sizing, set to border box. And this is going to ensure that the margin is going to be added outside of elements. And it's also not going to be contributed to the overall width of an element. And padding is going to be added to the inside of an element. And this is just based off of how we expect padding and margin to behave. So we just like to set that here in our reset. Then we want to set margin to 0 and padding to 0. So if we save that, you'll actually see now, because we've reset these to 0, it's resetting the out of the box stylings for Chrome. So now none of these elements have padding or margin applied to them. So next up, let's go ahead and just add colors to our body here. So let's do background color, and we'll set this to a variable. So var, and then the name of the variable, and that's going to be dark1. So if we save that, you can now see the body is that dark value. So next up, we're going to write the feature styles. And let's go ahead and give this a min height of 500. So this is going to ensure that the minimum the height is 500, but once we resize this, it's going to scale in order to fit the content. So that's why we write it like this. Next up, we're going to actually start defining our grid, which is what we talked about in the Figma tutorial. And then we need to define the grid template columns. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to write one FR for the first value. And this is the first column. And what FR, you might have not seen this before, but it's a really cool property that we get to use with grid. And essentially it's a calculated value left that's calculated based off of what's left over in our project. Now the 12 columns that we're about to create are going to have a max width of 1160, but our browser can be bigger than 1160. And we want that left and right areas as kind of like a margin. And this margin is going to be flexible because we've written it in a way that's flexible, a flexible unit, which is the fraction unit here. So let's go ahead and write those 12 columns. And I think this is going to make more sense once we do this. So in order to write the 12 columns, we could do like 60 pixels, 60 pixels, 60 pixels all the way over. But we have an easier way to do that, and that's to use repeat. And in this repeat, I'm actually going to first say how many columns we want. So that's going to be 12. And I'm actually going to use another helper here called min max. And this allows us to set a minimum value that we want a column to be and a maximum value that we want a column to be. Now a minimum, we just want to set that to auto. So it's going to auto fit based off of what is left in the size of the browser. And the max, the biggest we want a column to get is 60 pixels. And this 60 pixels is calculated from our design. So you remember I said we want the max width of this to only be 1160. So we want these columns to be 60 times 12. And then we also have this gap, so 40 times 11. And when you add those two together, you're going to have a max width of 1160, which is why we're setting those values like this. So now that we wrote the 12 columns, we need that one FR on the right as well, which is going to act as some white space. So let's go ahead and do that and then save it. You can see things have changed, but it doesn't look right because we haven't told what these sections should do. We haven't told it how much space it should take up. But we'll do that here in just a few minutes. So next up, let's go ahead and add the grid column gap. And this is going to be 40 pixels. And then what we want to do is we want to align the items to the center. And this is going to move just a little bit. So you can see that it moved down and it's now centered on this 500 pixel feature section. So let's go ahead and set the background color here so we can see that section a little better. We're going to set that to a variable of light. So now you can see how those elements are nice and centered in this feature section. And last, we want to set a padding of 50 pixels on the top, bottom, left, and right. And we can just write that really simply by just writing one variable here. All right, so next up, we want to focus on the feature left. And here's where we're going to define how much space this should take up. So first up, we want to say grid column start. So where should this column start? So if we come into our design, you can see that it's technically starting on the second column. But because we have that one extra column here, we technically have 14 columns. So it's actually not starting on the second, it's starting on the third. So let's make sure we write that here. So that's going to be a third, so 3. And grid column end is how many columns it's going to span. So again, if we come back into our design, you can see that this section spans 5 columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we can just carry that same information over here. So span 5. If we save that, we can now see this is starting to take shape. So next up is the feature right. So I'm just going to copy this, change this to right. And this one is going to start on 8. And this one's going to span 5 as well. So if we save that, you can see it kind of changed. There's a couple more things we need to add here. So let's go ahead and just inspect this really quick. So if we see the feature right, you can see that area, but the SVG needs to be in the center of it. And what we're going to use is display grid in order to do that. So first let's do display, or excuse me, not display grid, but display flex. And then what we can do really simply to center this is just say justify content and then set that to center. So if we save that, you can see now that this section, the SVG, is now in the center of this new feature right section. All right, so that's everything for the feature right. Now we can go ahead and move on to the next part, which is going to be the feature header. All right, so now that we have feature header, we can define the font family. The font family is going to be Roboto, and the fallback is going to be sans serif. So you can start to see that take shape. Font weight, it's going to be 700. And the font size is going to be 36 pixels. We want to set the color to one of the variables, and that variable is going to be a dark 1. And we want the margin bottom to a variable as well. And that's going to be space 20. Oops. So we can see that gave a little bit of spacing here from the text. And now we can move on to the next section, which is going to be the feature text. And here we want a font family of Laura. And the fallback here is actually going to be serif. So a serif style font. And the color is going to be a variable set to dark 2. And the font weight is going to be 400. Font size is going to be 18 pixels. And if you didn't come from the Figma tutorial, we're getting these values right from Figma. So you can see here in our design, we used Laura, regular, and a size of 18 pixels. And the color here is set to that hex code that we set up in our CSS root. So just wanted to make sure that was clear where these values were coming from in case you didn't watch the first video. And then we want to add a margin bottom to this as well. So let's do margin bottom. And that's going to be set to that variable as well. All right, so next up we have the feature CTA. And this is going to have a font family to Laura as well. So let's just copy this. And this is going to have a color to the accent. So let's go ahead and set that variable here. Font weight is going to be 700. Font size is 18 pixels. We need to set the cursor to pointer. So once we hover over it, it's going to show the pointer cursor instead of the default. Text decoration is going to be none. And we're going to add a transition to this. So once we hover over it, it's going to have a nice smooth transition instead of just changing instantly. And we'll set that animation to 0.3 seconds. We'll just go ahead and apply this to all of the things that are changing. And then we can write out ease, which is going to be the type of motion that we want. So instead of a linear motion, it's going to ease in and have this nice kind of fluid kinetic change instead of one linear change. All right, so now that we have that saved, let's go ahead and write the feature call to action hover pseudo class. In this, we're actually going to use a filter, and we're going to use brightness, and we're just going to increase the brightness by 200%. And now once we hover over this, you can see that this gets lighter once we do that. So that's basically everything for the design. We just now need to make this responsive. So once, if we expand this, you can see that the max width here is really working. But once we, make this too small, it's going to break. So we need to fix that. And what we're going to do is write some media queries. So to do that, we say @media. And then we're targeting the screen. And what we want to do is we want to set a max width here of where we want these styles to be applied. And I'm going to apply these right once the screen hits 960 pixels. And in here is what we're going to override. So on feature, we want, I'm going to make the grid columns a little smaller. So grid column gap is going to be 10 pixels. And on the next thing we want to do is feature left. So feature left. And here is something that's really cool with Flexbox and Grid that you can do is the order property. So by default, because this is the second child, it's technically the second in order. But by defining order here, we can change that. So we actually want the left to be the second thing, and then we want this to be the first. So this is going to be on top, and then this is going to be on bottom. And we can define that by using the order property. So we can say, hey, we want this to be 2 instead of 1. Grid column start. We want this to start on 2. And we want the grid column end to span 12. So it's going to span all 12 columns. Then let's go ahead and just copy this feature left, paste it below, and then change this to right. We want this one, instead of being 2, it's going to be 1. And we want this to have grid column start and span to both be the same thing, but we want to add a margin bottom here of the 20 pixels. So margin bottom, and then we can set that to the variable. So let's go ahead and save that. And now once we come down, you'll see that resizes really nicely. And there you go. Now you've designed and coded a really cool feature section that you can use in your next project. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other design and coding courses on skillthrive.com and on our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next video.